came to recognize that his parents were people. And he came to recognize the person that the defendant was in his life. And for the defendant, the last family member who had any contact with him was starting to realize why every other family member had broken off that contact with the defendant. That's what's happening in the time from September through November of 2012. We are here today because this man killed Dylan Redwine. And it's a murder trial. So we spent a lot of time talking about the evidence that proves him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's talk for a moment about Dylan. He was killed when he was 13 years old. Let us not forget that when we talk about luminol and phenolphthalein and human trace and DNA and human brain dogs, we're talking about a 13-year-old boy whose life was ended. Let us not forget when we talk about sharp force injuries to the right zygomatic arch of the partial cranium, that we're talking about the head of Dylan Redwine. Let us not forget when we look at phone logs and cell records, text messages, that we're actually talking about the last words of a 13-year-old boy who this defendant killed on November 18th, 2012. Because of what the defendant did, this world will never know Dylan Redwine beyond that day. We'll never know the impact that he would have had on this world today. His high school years, college, a future, a family of his own, all those things were robbed because of that guy. We'll never know. But behind the 5 weeks of trial that we've spent here together and the mountain of evidence against this defendant is the life of a 13-year-old boy that was robbed by this defendant on November 18th, 2012. We have learned during this trial, while listening to the evidence against the defendant, a fair amount about Dylan. He was a young boy. He was happy. He was engaging. He lit up the room. The witnesses talked about the impact he had on their lives. Everyone who took the stand and swore to tell you the truth told you about Dylan and the positive impact he had on them. Amanda Saxton told you Dylan was feisty, and he would stand up and fight for those that he loved and for what he believed was right, and that Dylan loved his family and was severing the relationship with the defendant because of the defendant's incredibly hateful conduct to his mother and his brother, as well as the photographs and the deteriorating relationship between the defendant and Dylan. Even for Dylan, a loving boy at heart, this relationship was severing. It was slicing, and it was cutting, and it was coming to an end. Because the defendant's words and his deeds had pushed this loving young boy to a point where Dylan no longer wanted to have any contact with the defendant. And the only reason that he had contact with the defendant was because the court ordered him to do so. I'm sorry, Your Honor. Dylan Redwine was beloved by his family. And like many 13-year-old kids, he had become very close with his friends, old and new. And he stayed in constant contact with them through his phone, email, text, and social media, and left a trail of breadcrumbs for us to follow to this defendant. Because like many teenagers at age 13, Dylan had connected with his friends at a level that he wanted to maintain. And we've seen throughout this trial the impact that Dylan's loss had on his family. We've seen Dylan's family cry when they see pictures, and cry when they see possessions, and cry when they remember Dylan. And we've seen his family do that. And by family, I should be clear, I'm talking about Elaine Hall and Corey Redwine. we've seen how much this still impacts them to this day, the loss of Dylan. They look to his photos for his memories. We look to the evidence to hold his killer accountable today. For Dylan's friends, they lost someone far too young, who they are incredibly close to. And when a young person loses someone in their life that young, that memory can either become an inspiration for them to live their best lives or a burden they never overcome. And you saw the burden that each one of them took to the stand, the love they have for Dylan, the impact that he had on their lives, that they still carry with them to this day from when the defendant ended his life in November of 2012. For the friends and family of Dylan Redwine, all they have left are the memories. But we also have the evidence to hold this man accountable for what he did to Dylan Redwine on November 18th, 2012. The disappearance and murder of Dylan had such an incredibly profound impact on his family, his friends, and this community, ladies and gentlemen. And for the witnesses who testified under oath, 9 years have passed since Dylan was killed. And lives have changed, some because of the murder. It's clearly hurt them in a deep way. But for everyone involved in this case, everyone who came from this community to help with this case, they did so to answer the call for help for Dylan. And it may be difficult for some to think about, how could a father kill his own son? How does a father kill his son? And deny the world Dylan Redwine? Well, it's a story that's been told for years, for centuries, in Greek mythology, the Bible, and for too many days and too many communities across the nation, and in this community on November 18th, 2012. Because the defendant killed his son because they were in a deteriorating, damaged relationship that turned deadly on November 18th, 2012. At its core, this is a simple and tragic case. Who was the last person seen with Dylan Redwine, a 13-year-old boy? Who was with Dylan at the very moment that Dylan was never heard from again? The answer to both those questions is the defendant, ladies and gentlemen, because he knowingly killed Dylan on November 18th, 2012, when he was the only person with access to Dylan, and the last person Dylan was with when he ever communicated with anyone in the entire world. Who had the opportunity and reason to hurt Dylan? And who had Dylan's blood in his house? The answer to both those questions is the same, and it's this man. He had the opportunity, he had the reason, and he ends up with the blood in his house. Who had the smell of a dead body in the same room and outside the home? Who had the smell of a dead body on his clothes and in his truck? And then, after the disappearance of Dylan, after he dumped his son's body on the mountainside, whose behavior was incredibly evasive, suspicious, and misleading, not just to law enforcement, not just to the FBI, not just to search and rescue, not just to the friends and family, to you. And we're going to go through what he did in the hours, days, and weeks that followed Dylan's disappearance, because that demonstrates that this is a murder. The defendant knowingly killed Dylan and then did everything he could to avoid responsibility. Whose house was very close to where the remains were found? And that's the defendant. And what do the remains tell us? Two things. First, some of Dylan's belongings are gone from the remain site. The only person with reason to do that is the defendant, who doesn't want Dylan's body identified or connected to him. And what did Dylan's remains, which the defendant did his best to dispose of, and he almost succeeded. But what do the remains tell us about what the defendant did on November 18th, 2012? What does it say when you see blunt force trauma and sharp force injuries to the right zygomatic arch of the partial cranium, Dylan's head? The defendant knowingly killed Dylan Redwine, ladies and gentlemen, and that is why we are here. And when you look at each one of these questions, it's a simple and tragic case. Occam's razor. You slice and cut away the things that are unreasonable and look at what the evidence shows you. The defendant's going to argue, as he has throughout the trial, that all these things are simply a coincidence. A wise man once said, coincidences are the universe's way of pointing you to truth. These are not simply a string of random coincidences. Every question is answered the same. The defendant. He killed Dylan Redwine on November 18th, 2012, ladies and gentlemen. Let's break down each one of those, and I'm going to go over the evidence in support of each one of those factors. Each one of those pieces of evidence that proves the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree and child abuse resulting in death. The defendant's the last person seen with Dylan. He picked up Dylan from the airport on November 18th, 2012 at around 5:45 p.m. Less than 5 hours later, in a fairly isolated area near Vallecito Lake, Dylan is never heard from again and never seen again. When Dylan arrives at the airport, think about that moment. Because when he arrives at the airport, he does not want to be with the defendant. He's expressed that to his friends. His friends in Colorado Springs who you heard from, Joe Ceballos, Adam Harvey, Kristen Baird, all talked about how desperately Dylan did not want to come here, did not want to be with this man, how he had fear in his eyes, he was scared, and did not want to go. Dylan had communicated with his friends that he did not want to be with the defendant. Dylan had communicated with his family that he did not want to visit the defendant. He had told his mom, his brother, his stepfather, I do not want to go. So much so that his mom called the attorney, Amber Harrison, and said, is there any way we can keep Dylan from having to travel there? Does Dylan really have to go? But Dylan had to go because the court ordered him to do so. Dylan had told his stepdad, Mike Hall, that he did not want to go. And he told him about the reasons why he did not want to go. And Mike Hall said, you have to go and just hang out with your friends when you get there. Make plans with your friends when you get there. You can imagine how troubling it was for Dylan at age 13 that he had to go spend time alone in the Vallecito house with the defendant. Given the lead up, the history, the photographs, and the things you've learned about throughout the course of this trial, the 3 months leading up to it in which Dylan never spoke to the defendant, he wanted to break all contact and he wanted that relationship severed. It's not surprising that all those ongoing events in their relationship would lead Dylan to want to avoid this visit at all costs. Told his friends and his family that he did not want to go. It also, in essence, told the defendant. He certainly hadn't been hiding his feelings, because in September, when the court asked Dylan, who do you want to live with, and Dylan said, my mom, after that, after the pictures, after the text messages, after the court hearing, Dylan broke off contact with the defendant. And by September 2012, Dylan is no longer texting or calling or returning any of the messages that he gets from the defendant. And you see that in Exhibit 480, where the defendant sends 11 text messages to Dylan over the span of nearly 2 months, and not a single response from Dylan. And the only responses before that were with regards to the debit card, which we'll come back to. But otherwise, Dylan has severed this relationship. He is done. He does not want to have contact with the defendant. The defendant's fully aware of it, and he's angry about it and frustrated about it. And you see that in Exhibit 8, where the defendant emails Elaine, and he copies his attorney on it. This is Sunday, November 11th, 2012. A week from this date, Dylan will be dead. By now, you should have received Dylan's flight itinerary. As you know, Dylan has failed to respond to all my communication attempts, so I'll have to rely on you to inform him of his travel. Also, since you have failed to address any support issues you may have, I expect all his needs are being addressed. So all the monies in his personal account are not needed. XXX. We'll talk more about the personal account in a little while, but this email from the defendant confirms that 1 week before the murder, he knows his son wants nothing to do with him. He wants to break off all contact. So think for a moment about Dylan arriving at the airport. Dylan does not want to be there. He knows it, and he's frustrated and obviously angry to the point where he's talking about taking Dylan's personal money out of Dylan's own bank account. And he's emailing Elaine, the mother, and copying the attorney because he's going to enforce that court order and force Dylan to visit. What you don't see there is a, hey, why doesn't Dylan want to come? Hey, I haven't heard from Dylan. Is everything okay? Hey, can you set up a time for me to talk to Dylan? I want to sort out what's going on. He hasn't responded to me. It's a, he's coming, here's my attorney's email address, and by the way, I might take the money out of his personal account. That's the state of their relationship on November 18th, 2012, when Dylan heads to the airport and flies to Durango, which is why when the defendant goes to pick up his son at the airport, he knows how frustrated Dylan is and how much Dylan doesn't want to be with him, and we know how frustrated he becomes. And from the very beginning, we see that. The defendant talks with Agent Grusing about how Dylan did not want to be there and was standoffish. Dylan had made his feelings perfectly clear. From the moment they go to the airport, leave the airport and go to Walmart, and Ms. Burton, who's been working at Walmart for over 20 years and looks at these security videos all the time, it's part of her job, and on cross-examination on a question from the defense, said he just looked like he did not want to be there. They spend 41 minutes in Walmart. They're barely together. And when they are together, the evidence will show they're not getting along. They're barely together in Walmart. They haven't seen each other in over 2.5 months. This is the relationship that's going to turn deadly in about 5 hours, ladies and gentlemen. Dylan does not want to be there, and it's why he does everything he can to avoid his father, including having reached out to Ryan Nava earlier that day. He reaches out to Ryan at 12:05. Can I stay with you tonight? He hasn't even arrived in Durango, and he's trying to make a plan so he doesn't have to be with the defendant. Ryan says, if we get back in time, yeah, and then follows up with, you can. We'll be home around 8 or 9 p.m. In one of the few interactions that we see between the defendant and Dylan in Walmart, we now know from this text message that Dylan's asking the defendant, can I stay with Ryan Nava tonight? Which obviously means, I don't want to stay with you. And the defendant says, no. And Dylan sends a message from Walmart at 6:57, can't come, sorry, I'll hang tomorrow. And if you watch the Walmart video, you see at 6:57, they're walking down the aisle together talking at that point. That's where the defendant's telling Dylan, no, you can't stay with your friend. It's confirmed by Ryan saying, did your dad say no? Dylan says, yeah. Can I come over early, like 6:30 early tomorrow? He's just arrived in Durango. He hasn't seen the defendant in 2.5 months. And he's saying, how quickly can I get out of this house? And the defendant's fully aware of that. And we're going to talk more about the impact that it had on the defendant. As he explained to FBI agent Grusing, it led to tension. It made the defendant angry. Dylan wants to be out of that house as quickly as possible. So he's texting Ryan Nava at about 6:30 in the morning, coming to Ryan's house and being with Ryan instead of being with the defendant. And we know after this text exchange from Walmart that the defendant wants to go have a sit-down dinner where he can eat and drink with Dylan. And Dylan says, no, I'd rather just get takeout from McDonald's. So they go to the drive-thru at McDonald's, and Dylan is never seen again. He goes with the defendant to the defendant's house in a fairly isolated area, and he's with the one person that he does not want to be with. And it's obvious to the defendant that Dylan doesn't want to be there. The defendant himself confirmed this state of affairs when he spoke with the FBI, and he told Agent Grusing about how Dylan was standoffish and wanted to go to Ryan Navas, and the defendant denied the request. He said, you can't go, and that Dylan was upset by that. So Dylan is now left with having to spend the night in his house. And he says to Ryan, about the 6:30 a.m. visit, you better let me in. And Ryan Nava responds, I will. Dylan says, I call your all day if you don't. And instead, he never called Ryan Nava again. This is the last time that Dylan would ever have an opportunity to call Ryan Nava. And the next day, when Dylan so desperately wants to see Ryan that he's going to call his ass all day, if he has to, he doesn't call a single time because he's dead. And Ryan will never get another phone call from Dylan for all these years and all these years to come because of this man. The defendant confirmed all this to Agent Grusing and talked about how there was tension about this. And Dylan, and this is an important fact we'll talk about later, that Dylan told the defendant he was going to meet Ryan Nava at 6:30 the next morning. Do you remember that? He was going to meet Ryan Nava at 6:30 the next morning, and the defendant was going to drive him to Ryan Nava's house so he could be there for the 6:30 a.m. meeting that they set. And we're going to be coming back to that in a few minutes, ladies and gentlemen. So Dylan is last seen alive with the defendant. They leave the Walmart. They go home to the defendant's isolated home out by Vallecillo Lake, but they're not alone in the car. Along with them in that ride is tension and anger with them. And the defendant's the last one to see Dylan alive. But there's more. Because we know the defendant doesn't drop Dylan off anywhere on the way, and they end up back at the house in Vallecillo. In just a couple hours, Dylan will never be heard from again. He's in that house in Vallecillo, and we have a young boy, Dylan, who's on Facebook, text message, his phone all the time. And he leaves that trail of breadcrumbs for us to follow so that justice will come. His friends testified that Dylan responds to their texts immediately, all the time, and you see it in the exhibits that have been entered into evidence. He's in regular contact with his mom, Elaine, since landing in Durango. They're talking, and you can look at the times. It's 1 or 2 minute responses, boom, 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 the whole day until Dylan's life is ended. He's in repeated contact with his friends since landing in Durango. And he's texting from the defendant's house throughout that evening. We have the Wi-Fi from the defendant's house. So as the defense continues to assert maybe there wasn't a good enough signal, you have the text messages and the iPod messages that Dylan is sending to his friends that evening from the defendant's house. The text with Amanda Saxton. Dylan, I think you're talking about something. They're doing this flirtatious conversation back and forth. What do you think I'm talking about? Nothing, says Dylan. Amanda says, no, tell me, kitty. Her nickname for Dylan. He says, sissy, sissy, sissy. And she responds, and then Dylan says, is pimpin', which is a phrase that he had started using. That's the last communication that Dylan has with anyone in the entire world. And when he sends it, he's sitting in a room with this guy. with tension and anger. That's the last message he ever sent. And Amanda Saxton testified, as to Dylan's other friends, that he wouldn't have dropped off like this. He would have sent something else after this. He would have said, I have to go, or where'd you go, or good night. He wouldn't have dropped off like this, with this being the last message he ever sends. And we know that at 9:56 p.m., when he's alone with the defendant in that living room, as the defendant admitted to Agent Grusing, Dylan's phone goes off. All communication ceases. Dylan is off the grid because his life is over. So let's consider these facts, ladies and gentlemen, and the fact that really helps us understand what's going on in that living room is Dylan's trail of communication. It really is the breadcrumb trail that we could follow to what happened. Because at 9:37 p.m., Dylan has no further contact with anyone. No text at all with anyone after that. He's texting throughout the evening before going radio silent at 9:37 p.m. So he's not just last seen with the defendant. The defendant is with Dylan when Dylan is never heard from again. And there's only one person in the room with him when that happens, and it's the defendant. Now, the defendant makes your job somewhat easier, and he makes a mistake when he says Dylan is alive and awake that night and alive and awake the next morning. Because the facts, the evidence, and common sense prove that's impossible. First, you look at Dylan's use of phones and social media. This was a kid, like many teenagers, on the phone and social media all the time. He's very connected to his friends. He responds immediately. He's in frequent contact with them and with his family. He doesn't respond to his friends that night. He doesn't respond to his mom, who asks if he's doing okay. He also doesn't check Facebook, which he checks every day. He doesn't check it late that night, and he never checks it again. And on November 19th, his Facebook page shows 0 activity. Dylan is gone. He is gone. At the same time, he's in the living room with this man who's angry with him about a damaged and deteriorating relationship. They were texting, him and his mom, on the 18th, 7:03 p.m. Your dad gets you, son? Yes. I miss you already, but try and have fun. How's it going, son? You okay? No response to this text. That's at 8:09 p.m. How you doing, son? I miss you. That's on November 19th. 11:19, his friends start looking for him. We have text messages going from Ryan Nava to Dylan. 6:46 a.m. Where are you? And the importance of this text message, ladies and gentlemen, is that at 6:46 a.m., if this defendant's telling the truth, which he is not, Dylan is awake and in the house and already 16 minutes late meeting up with his friend. Because the defendant tells Elaine and also tells the FBI agent that he spoke with Dylan that morning. So where's the phone call or the text to Ryan Nava saying, hey, I'm going to be late? 7:30. Ryan Nava's now calling Dylan to say, where are you? You're supposed to be here at 6:30. No answer. Come to Nando's. Dude, your dad's looking for you at 4:12 p.m. Are you all right, dude? 7:59. You need to call somebody, anybody, ASAP. We're all worried about you. Your mom called, and she's worried, bro. 8 o'clock. Seriously, when you get the message, call someone. The key piece here for you is that the defendant has told us that Dylan is alive and awake in the morning. It makes your job easier because you realize if he was alive and awake in the morning, his day looks much different. Because the defendant says he's leaving the house at 7:30 in the morning. That's the time he says he left the house. That's the time that Ryan Nava is calling to say, where are you? And texting. If the defendant's story were true, he would be responding to Ryan. He'd be responding to his mom. He'd be up and checking Facebook. And the defendant gives no explanation as to why Dylan has suddenly stopped using his phone, his iPod, and his life to communicate with his friends. And if the defendant's story were true about the morning, why would Dylan not have taken the ride to Ryan Nava's house? Why would the defendant not tell him, text or call Ryan, we're supposed to be over there at 6:30, we're already late? And why is Dylan not answering the 7:30 in the morning call, ladies and gentlemen? Dylan were alive on the morning of November 19th, and you know a lot about Dylan Redwine. We never had the privilege of meeting him, but you know a lot about him. And you know how much contact he has with his friends, and you know how much he communicates with them, and you know how much he uses his phone. And he has gone completely dark by this time. If he were actually alive on the morning of the 19th, like this guy wants you to believe, he would have been in touch with Ryan. He would have been at Ryan's house. He would have texted Ryan or called Ryan. He would have responded to his mom. He would have been on Facebook. And instead, Dylan is never heard from again. So the defendant makes your job easier when he doesn't tell the truth to law enforcement and the FBI, and he says Dylan is alive and awake and talking to him on the morning of November 19th. He actually makes your job a little easier. We have the trail of breadcrumbs, and that trail has come to a cold end by the time the sun rises on November 19th. And so is Dylan's life. Dylan is dead by this time. And that's why he has gone completely radio silent, off the grid, dark. Because this defendant ended his life. And then he would begin doing everything he could to avoid this day, and to avoid responsibility, and to avoid the time that a jury would be asked to hold him accountable for what he did to Dylan. He's the last person seen with Dylan, and he's with Dylan when Dylan is never heard from again. But there's more. The defendant had the opportunity and the reason to hurt Dylan. The opportunity part is easy. The two of them are alone in a house, together, at the end of a 20-mile road that comes to a dead end. It's an isolated area. There is no one else there. No one drives by the house. Very few people are staying in the area, and the two of them are alone. Two people alone in the house, one of them is killed. This isn't like a Clue mystery game or a movie like Knives Out, where you have 10 people living in a dark mansion at night, and there's a bunch of people who want one person dead, and that person ends up dead, and it's a mystery. If this were Clue, or a movie like Knives Out, it wouldn't be very long. There's two people in a room, and one person ends up killed. That person is the murderer. It's a simple and tragic story. And not at all like a board game, and not at all like a movie in terms of the consequences and what happened to Dylan. But he had every opportunity to do this. And he also had reason to do it. We told you in jury selection that you'd hear comments and testimony, and you have, about a time in Dylan's life where he loved his dad and said things like that and hung out with his dad and went on trips. We told you that from the very beginning. And that had been their past relationship. But when you look at the timeline, by the August trip, Corey and Dylan's mom, Elaine, are now in an incredibly tumultuous and contentious relationship with the defendant. And the defendant's very angry with them, has no contact with them, and the relationships have gone south. On the August trip, where Dylan's with his father, they're in a hotel. Once again, the defendant is talking and criticizing Elaine and Corey. This upsets Dylan. He is going to stand up for those he loves. He doesn't like when this defendant continues to badmouth his mom and his brother. He calls Corey, and Corey steps out of the movie theater, and Dylan is making a request. And you can see that request in Exhibit 482. Hey, send me those poop pics of Papa. He gave a speech about you guys being a bad example, and I want to show him what he really is. That text is sent from Dylan to Corey at 10:35. You got him yet? You got him yet? And then at 11:19, hey, send me those poop pics of Papa, because he gave a speech about you guys being a bad example, and I want to show him what he really is. Dylan then sends that message again, 11:19, 11:21, 11:22, 11:24, 11:24 again, and 11:27. And Corey Redwine doesn't want to send them to Dylan, because he knows that Dylan is going to use them to hit the defendant's emotional target. So Corey says, hey, my email got wiped. I've lost the photos. But Dylan had already seen them. He saw what they were about. And you know from Agent Grusing that the defendant then goes on Dylan's phone and sees what this is about. This was a deteriorating and damaged relationship by August. They have a fierce argument. Dylan leaves the hotel room. And after this, in the September custody hearing, Dylan asked to be with his mother and further rejects the defendant. That same day, and it's no coincidence it's the same day, when the judge grants primary custody to Elaine Hall, the very same day, the defendant books this trip that brings us here today. It's the act of an angry man who's going to hold that court order in place. And Dylan then rejects his father further, not returning his text, ignoring his calls, and trying to get out of the court-ordered visit in November. It's no coincidence, ladies and gentlemen, that the last person seen with Dylan, the last person with Dylan, when he's last heard from, also happens to be alone and angry with Dylan. It is a broken and toxic relationship, not just with Dylan, but also with the rest of the family. And in some ways, this is about more than the anger the defendant has at Dylan. And what he does is more than just anger at Dylan. It is rage at the family situation. You see it here in the timeline. So when we hear from people about a year earlier, they were hanging out and having a nice time, that's great. But what matters is the timeline before this happens, because that tells you where they were and how their relationship was working when Dylan was killed. And Joseph Bios testified, his good friend from Colorado Springs, Dylan had fear in his eyes. Kristen Baird said Dylan was scared and did not want to go. And we were hugging him. It turned out to be the last time they would ever have a chance to hug Dylan. And the defendant was not taking this rejection very well. And again, it's about more than just Dylan. And perhaps you were struck by this as well. But he's so bent on forcing the relationship with Dylan and enforcing that court order that's going to require Dylan to come here. And Dylan does not want to come. He doesn't want to be with him anymore. So his mom calls Amber Harrison. And perhaps she was struck by the fact that the attorney takes the stand. And she starts crying. And you suddenly realize she too feels guilt. Because she told Elaine, you have to put him on the plane, or you're going to be held in contempt of court. And the attorney is crying because she realized that she was just doing her job and giving the right advice, but dooming Dylan, dooming him. Because after he arrived, 5 hours later, he is dead. So when Amber Harrison takes the stand, she cries because she realizes, through no fault of hers at all, that Dylan ended up with the defendant, serving a sentence that he did not want to serve, that the court required him to serve, in being with this man. And when you think about some of the family dynamics here, ladies and gentlemen, the anger really is about so much more than just Dylan. And you see that. You see that when Dylan goes missing, he's gone. The last place he's seen is with the defendant in the defendant's house. And the defendant tells the FBI, I think it's probably because of Elaine. He may have ran away because of Elaine. And Agent Grusing says, what are you talking about? He left Elaine and he's here now. Why would he run away from her when he's here? Even in their opening statement to you, they had a slide up here with Elaine's picture. And they said, she's the main generator as to why we're here. What are we talking about? She was hundreds of miles away. Her alibi checked out. Her son is killed. And even here at trial, the defendant's blaming her. She's the main generator. Her son was killed. This case, for 9 years, and the relationship building up to Dylan's murder was about more than just the anger that the defendant had towards Dylan and the rage he acted with that night. The whole family dynamic. You might think you're reading like Shakespearean work, where the father is isolated, alone, and angry, and every family member has left, except the adorable, cute boy who's left behind because he has to be there pursuant to the court order. And then the defendant acts out and kills that boy because of his anger towards that boy and everyone else. But unlike Shakespeare, this is no fiction. And in real life, we never get to meet Dylan Redwine again because he's dead on November 18th, 2012. Because upon arriving, the defendant gets more rejection from Dylan. At the airport, at Walmart, Ryan Nava, the phone call, and being on the phone, not wanting to go to dinner with his dad, wanting to go to McDonald's. By the defendant's own admission to the FBI, there's tension in the house. What rejection happened in the house that was finally too much for the defendant? What did Dylan say? What did Dylan do that finally infuriated him? Like many murder cases, we'll never know because the victim is dead. And most murder cases don't happen in public. But without the victim, we're left with the evidence, the mountain of evidence against this man. And we know that Dylan's in the living room, and Dylan's the kind of kid who's going to stand up for his mom, stand up for his brother. We know Dylan knows about the poop pics, as he calls them. I could show them to you, but you remember them, ladies and gentlemen. Think about the impact they had on his 13-year-old son and how desperately Dylan wanted to use them during that August fight. Do you think it would have taken much for Dylan to use them in November, to bring them up, to talk about them? So perhaps it's the poop pics. I can't tell you what was going on in his mind that night. Perhaps Dylan just said, F you. Perhaps Dylan cursed at him.
That's not bad. Very speculative.
You'll be allowed to comment on the lack of evidence when you argue, Mr. Bowden. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. But we know by the defendant's own admission that there's tension and anger that night. And we know from Dylan's comments to his friends, family, that he does not want to be there. It would not have taken much. And you're allowed to consider the pictures of the defendant with the feces smeared on the diaper and him wearing the women's lingerie and eating the feces out of the diaper as evidence of the deteriorating relationship as well as a possible motive. But whether it was the diaper pictures, which had obviously an impact on Dylan and Corey, both were terribly disturbed by seeing their dad like that, or whether it was Dylan just saying something. The defendant had had enough. And we know with the pictures what that meant in their lives. So when it comes to the pictures, Corey Redwine took the stand and testified under oath. And he told you Dylan lost all reason to look up to his father on that day, the day they found the pictures on the computer. We know the defendant becomes violently enraged when someone confronts him with the pictures. We know that. And we know that because Kathy Berry went to the defendant's house and in a colorful string of profanities, also pointed out to the defendant that she was aware of the pictures. And the defense introduced an exhibit and read part of the exhibit to you. It's under Defense 1900. What's really interesting is what you see in the rest of this transcript. This is a transcript of a phone call with Kathy Berry, where she's talking about the log incident, where she called the defendant an S-eater, and the defendant exploded. And she says, in Defense Exhibit 1900, it was frightening. The look on his face, you know, it's like, that's just like you just saw this snap of rage, which, you know, I mean, who knows? I mean, what if Dylan did say something to him about those pictures? That's something that frightens me. That is, what if he did? I saw a side of him that really gets to him. You mentioned that, and man, he is a different man. He is a different man. This transcript was introduced by the defense for another part of the conversation with Ms. Berry. You should take a look at Defendant's 1900. A different side of that man. We know Dylan, from Elaine Hall's testimony, is disgusted, ashamed, and willing to use those pictures to defend his mom and brother. We know that last part from all those text messages. So whatever the spark, we know what happened that night. We also know how much...
Are the photos legitimate? No, they are not. So that's not you and the photos? I'm not arguing that it's my Facebook photos. What I'm arguing is the fact that they were fabricated, because it was actually, I believe that Elaine and Corey were coming into my house, rummaging through going through my personal belongings when I traveled out of town. Because I have a keyless entry system on there, and Corey knew how to get into that. I found all kinds of things missing. And I came up with a scheme that had to be so outrageous that they could not talk about it. And that's exactly what I got out of that. Did I ever intend to be sitting here on your show having this conversation with you or them? Absolutely not.
They're saying they broke into your house and fabricated the picture.
I fabricated the pictures, left them available.
That's obviously not true, right? That he fabricated those pictures, you can look at them. There's no fabrication there. But he's willing to go on Dr. Phil and tell that story because of how badly he wants to hide this part of himself. So you can imagine the reaction if his 13-year-old son says something about it to him. A 13-year-old son who is ready and willing and anxious to do so in August. Whatever started it, we know Dylan will stand up for his mom and for Corey. And we see that in that Exhibit 482, where he's asking Corey for those pictures so he could stand up and fight for his family. Whatever it was, it just needed a spark because of how much their relationship had deteriorated. Whether it's a comment about the poop pictures, whether it's saying something else to the defendant, all it took was a spark, and that's what happened on November 18th, 2012. And that's why Dylan goes off the grid when he's in that living room. But there's more than that. It's more than deteriorating relationship before and what happened in the living room on November 18th, 2012, and all the evidence that comes after. But it's also everything the defendant does to cover it up and to avoid responsibility for what he did. We know that Dylan's murder was not caused by an accident. We know Dylan's murder was not caused by a bear because of all the evidence that comes before and everything that he did after. And all it took was a spark for this man to end Dylan's life, ladies and gentlemen. We also know that we have Dylan's blood in the same room. So at 9:37 p.m., we know the defendant and Dylan are in the living room. Dylan never has communication with anybody else again in the entire universe. And from the evidence in the case, we also know that's where the defendant killed Dylan. The defendant says they were spending time in the living room. There was tension. There was anger. In the living room, we have floors that were recently installed and purchased after the fire, and also new furniture. that was purchased after the fire. And Dylan had only been in the house on a few occasions between the floors and the furniture being purchased and the time when he was killed. And November 18th, 2012 would be his last time in that house. The living room is relatively new. You have the certificate of occupancy in evidence from April of 2011. It shows that the defendant was not living in the house for a period of time because of a fire. And the fire had required major renovations, including the new floor and the new furniture. And I know how close you paid attention throughout this trial, so you likely remember this. But the defense expert's on the stand, Richard Eichenblum, and he's talking about evidence in the living room. He's talking about the crime scene. He's trying to give you his expert opinion. And Mr. Johnson says to him, when was the fire? And Dr. Eichenblum says, what fire? And Mr. Johnson says, well, when did you get this? When did he get the new furniture? What new furniture? How about the new floors? When did he get the new floors? And the defendant's expert says, that would be relevant information. Heck, yes, to be relevant information, because if you're an expert, as Dr. Eichenblum is, and like the people's witnesses, you know that the amount of time someone spends in a house will factor into the analysis of why you're finding the person's blood there. We also know this from all the work that CDI did at the scene. As the defense expert says, luminol is especially helpful when the suspect cleans up. Luminol tests positive in the house, 5 different locations. Phenolphthalein, as the defense expert said, can rule out false positives. They also use phenolphthalein. And the way hemotrace, the only false positives with hemotrace are higher level primates, such as orangutans and chimps, and also ferrets. So we have 5 blood samples tested 3 different ways, positive. And the defense expert, upon hearing that, says CBI used a good procedure. So let's talk about what CBI did. We have Mr. Clayton, who's been in over 1,000 different crime scenes. And he tells you how, well, you already know this, how unusual it is to find blood cleaned up throughout a living room, particularly a living room with a new floor and new furniture. And the way the blood was spread out, there's a broad area, reflects to Mr. Clayton, who's an expert, that there was movement. Also, the blood being under the carpet but not on the carpet shows that someone has made efforts to clean it up. Throughout the trial, the defense fought hard to deny that it's the defendant's blood. The defense challenged every single witness on whether this is Dylan's blood or not. Think about the lengthy cross-examinations about whether it's Dylan's blood in the living room or not. They challenged the validity of the test, even the one that only has false positives when it's a chimp. And in a murder case, of course it makes sense for the defense to say the blood is not that of the victim. That makes sense, right? You would do that. Except it's too little too late, because when the evidence recovery team truck rolled up on November 29th, the defendant blurted out for the first time that Dylan was dripping blood in the living room. So as we continue to hear evidence throughout this trial about whether that blood is Dylan's or not, keep in mind that the defendant himself tells the FBI it is Dylan's blood. Now,
The jury will remember what the evidence is in their collective memories. You can comment on, I think it's a fair comment, you'll be able to do the same. Go ahead.
so you may remember that the defendant tells 3 false versions before that. It's a whole bunch of people, but ends up telling the FBI on November 29th when the truck pulls up, Dylan was dripping blood on the floor. So as we go through this trial, and as we talk about whether it's Dylan's blood or not, I would ask you to remember that the defendant has told us, after giving multiple false versions, the defendant has told you Dylan was bleeding on the floor. And we'll talk about that more in a little while. But we know it's Dylan's blood from the room. Remember, as Agent Grusing said, when you hear a statement by a suspect, look for vague statements or omissions. I would suggest to you that when the defendant leaves out any detail or mention of how he cleaned up the blood, that's that kind of vague statement. That's that kind of omission that Agent Grusing says to look out for. He says Dylan's dripping blood on the floor from an ulcer. That's his first version, or first version of the third statement. He never says how he cleaned it up, because he doesn't want to detail what he did to clean up a murder scene. We had a lot of discussion about whether blood can be cleaned up or not. Based on the defendant's statement, we know it was cleaned up. So it's not visible to the naked eye when CBI comes in pursuant to the court-ordered search warrant. And unlike what you've heard during this trial, the defendant never told Agent Grusing that blood's from an old injury, or that blood's Corey, so that blood might be mine, or it might be a false positive due to a chimp. The defendant admits Dylan was bleeding on November 29th. And he only admits that because the FBI truck is sitting outside, and they're about to find that themselves. At trial, though, his story changes yet again to what else the blood could be about or who else it could be from. But the evidence remains the same. So as you're deliberating and you're wondering about the blood, take the defendant's word for it. Dylan was bleeding in the living room. And for everything else to rely upon, we're going to talk about CBI and the work they did and the evidence that you can trust in reaching the right verdict. Why did he clean up the blood? Why does the defendant clean up the blood? He doesn't keep a particularly clean house, right? He doesn't have a house that's spotless. In fact, when we look at the photos from November 29th, Dylan's boarding pass from November 18th is still sitting on the bathroom counter. It's 11 days later. The pillow and the blankets are still on the couch on November 29th. The defendant cleans up the blood because he killed Dylan. He cleans up nothing else from that night. That's the only thing that he cleans up that night. Look at this in Exhibit 67. It is not a particularly clean house. Here in Exhibit 110, in the bathroom, that's Dylan's boarding pass from November 18th. It's still sitting there 11 days later when the FBI, CBI, and the sheriff's office come in to execute the court-ordered search warrant. Here we have Exhibit 340, which shows the different spots where blood was detected. 3 different tests at the scene used to find presumptively positive blood at 5 different locations. And as you know, these tests themselves are liquid, so they dilute some of the sample. So 2 of the swabs that are taken do not test positive at the lab, but the other 3 do. And all 5 of these locations indicate that Dylan's DNA is there. Then they run it with Star Mix. It's a highly sophisticated computer program that in large part confirms what Rebecca Strubb found when she did the testing when it first came to CBI. Each one of these locations, particularly the one around under the carpet, says so much about what went on in that living room that night. Dylan was alive in that living room alone with the defendant, with tension, anger, and blood and DNA. But there's more. We have the pillowcase. So let's talk about the pillowcase for a minute. The pillowcase, which the defendant told Search and Rescue Dylan slept on. Or actually, that's not what happened. Search and Rescue went in the house and said, do you have anything of Dylan's? We're going to use it to track him. No. What? Dylan had a bedroom there. Do you have anything of Dylan's? No. You don't have a single thing of Dylan's? No. And the gentleman from Search and Rescue, Roy Breland, tells you the defendant seemed frustrated and annoyed. He's trying to get something as a scent article. And the defendant's telling him that his son has not a single possession in the entire house. There's nothing there. Nothing at all. And Roy Breland says, well, what about that pillowcase? I mean, if he slept here, is that where he slept? And the defendant finally says, oh, yeah, you could take the pillowcase. The pillowcase that doesn't work. It doesn't work at all with the human remains dog or the tracking dog. That is further evidence, ladies and gentlemen, the defendant is trying to avoid Dylan being found and avoid responsibility for it. But there's more. We have the human remain detection K9 hitting on several locations. Molly, is a certified dog, and she has a proven track record. She's been in houses where she found nothing at all, and she's been in houses and cars and places where she found human remains. She's only had 2 false hits in her entire career working. She and her trainer have been together for years. This is the work they specialize in. And Molly hits on several locations. So you're asked by the defense to consider how long can a trained and certified canine detect human remains. And you may recall the defense called Dr. Ha to the stand and asked Dr. Ha, how long does the odor remain after someone's been killed and their body's there? And Dr. Ha said 24 to 48 hours. That's it. And he was asked on cross-examination, can you point to one study, one piece of scientific literature, anything at all to support that? No, it's just what I think. And how many searches have you been on with human remain dogs? I watched one years ago in Seattle. That's it. You can't rely on that testimony. We have Molly and the trainer who've been together and doing this kind of work for years. And her trainer's been doing the work for 20 years. Molly hits on several locations that day. 43. Outside the house, inside the house, up at the remain site. 43 positive indications for human remains. And she and her trainer did not know where Dylan's body had been. And here's what they come up with. In the threshold and over here. And this corner is key, because when Dylan is killed, this couch is over here. And in different places throughout the house. Human remains detection dog hits on multiple locations in the defendant's house. So in the living room, in the couch area, we have tension. We have the last text message Dylan will ever send in his life. We have the defendant later claiming we were roughhousing. We have blood. We have DNA. And we have a human remains canine. The defense has suggested to you this looks like everyone's living room. I would suggest to you this looks like the murderer's living room. This looks like the murderer's living room. Each one of these things on top of one another at all of these spots, they don't match up perfectly, and nor should they. You don't have blood and DNA and human remains all the same places. But that amount of evidence in that small an area, with no evidence being collected or seen in other parts of the house, when we know that's the last room that Dylan was in, by the defendant's own statement, that says so much, ladies and gentlemen. We know that we have the defendant's truck. And we know, although the defense expert had no idea how long the odor of human remains can exist, we know from the study and from the trainer's work that studies have been done showing up to 677 days after human remains are removed. And we have the positive hits on the defendant's truck in a number of different locations, including the bed of the truck in Exhibit 474. We also have it on his clothes, ladies and gentlemen. The clothes that you saw the defendant wearing in the Walmart video, those same clothes, the human remains dog hits on the outer shirt, the jeans, and the sneakers, indicating that he had been in contact with human remains. After Dylan's disappearance, after the murder, the defendant's behavior is incredibly suspicious, evasive, and misleading. And the only logical, reasonable reason for this is because he's the murderer. During jury selection, one of you said actions speak louder than words. Do you remember that? Actions speak louder than words. And that is certainly true. So let's talk about the defendant's behavior after Dylan goes missing, because that says so much about what he did that night and what he's going to do to try to cover it up and keep you from reaching the right verdict in the case. He goes to his workplace and his attorney's office, even though neither is set for a particular time for him. And you can see that in his phone records, he calls the attorney twice before he goes to her office. And you can infer that he did not have a set appointment with her for a particular time. If you're trying to get yourself an alibi or do a cover-up, going to work and your attorney are two good steps to take. But the fact that he didn't have set times for either says so much. And when he shows up, he looks incredibly haggard, tired, talking to Sean Boris at United Pipeline. And Richard Swayze says the defendant appeared more sober than usual. He still remembers that moment because it was so unusual. The defendant appeared more sober, and for the first time ever, and they've been working together for a long time, the defendant stands there talking to Mr. Swayze when Mr. Swayze's trying to work. And he talks to him for an hour and just goes on and on and on. They don't have any personal relationship. And here's a key part, ladies and gentlemen. The defendant tells the FBI that he left Dylan to sleep in, and that Dylan and he had a plan for the defendant to go back at 11 or 11:30 and now take him to Ryan Nava's house. That's their new plan, according to the defendant. He's going to come back at 11 or 11:30. But he's texting and calling Dylan during that time. Even though he told his son, you can sleep in and I'll come back at 11 or 11:30. This is how he's trying to create a cover story, ladies and gentlemen, and it will soon fall apart. But this is his attempt to try to cover his tracks. The attorney, the workplace, neither of which he had a set time, and then these calls and texts to Dylan. Then he leaves Durango after running his errands to go pick up Dylan for that fictional 11 o'clock, 11:30 pickup time. He tells Agent Grusing that he comes home through Bayfield in case he sees Dylan there. Now, Agent Grusing's from out of town. He had rolled down from Denver with the FBI team to help in locating Dylan. So he doesn't know what you know, which is that Bayfield is 21 miles from the house. If Agent Grusing knew it at the time, he would have said, what are you talking about? Bayfield is 21 miles from your house. How in the world would Dylan have gotten there? How would that have happened? And what would have happened to your plan to drive him? And think about the timing of this tall tale the defendant's telling Agent Grusing. He leaves the house at 7:30, Dylan's sleeping. It would take more than 4 hours to walk to Bayfield. So he tells Agent Grusing, I'm out looking for him already. It's 11 or 11:30, but I'm already on the search because I'm a caring dad. This is not the story of a caring dad. This is the story of a man who's going to try to cover his tracks so he won't be held responsible. Then he gets home and he finds Dylan's missing, and he reports it immediately. That's what you were told in the opening statement by the defendant. He reports it immediately. That's actually not true. The defendant says to Agent Grusing, he came home and Dylan is gone. And the TV is still on to Nickelodeon. Now, perhaps years earlier, Dylan watched Nickelodeon. Perhaps that's what he watched when the defendant had fond memories of their relationship from back in the day. But this is a kid who's texting with the N-word, and it's not Nickelodeon. And he's texting about different girls that he wants to be with, and he is a mature 13-year-old. He's not watching Nickelodeon, and he's not leaving the TV on to that channel. But this is the defendant's cover story. And he says he reported it immediately. That's what they tell you even here at the beginning of this trial. At every juncture, the defendant tells a story to try to avoid responsibility for what he did on November 18, 2012. In fact, what he did was take a nap and then report it 5 hours later. Takes his nap, he makes half-hearted attempts to find Dylan, and then, ladies and gentlemen, he goes to the Bayfield Marshal's office. As you know, from hearing Deputy Abdella testify, he appears unconcerned and does not want to file a report. He is a father. His kid's 13. The kid is missing. It's nightfall, and it's going to be cold outside at night. And he tells Deputy Abdella, no, you don't need to do an attempt to locate. He has no idea, actually, he knows exactly where his son is. And that's why he tells Deputy Abdella, don't bother, you don't need to do the attempt to locate. And he declines that. And Abdella says, you know what, you should call the mom or text the mom and see. And that's where we get the text messages between the murderer and the victim's mom, back and forth, where the victim's mom is saying, you seem so unconcerned. What are you doing right now? Why are you not anxious or upset? The reason he's not anxious or upset, and Elaine Hall knows this guy. She knows him. And she's saying, why are you not anxious? Why are you not upset? Why are you not freaked out? And he's saying, don't freak out. And she knows something is wrong. Something has happened. And if you line them up side by side and compare how the two act, you see how a concerned, loving parent acts and how the murderer who knows exactly where the body is acts. Because Elaine Hall calls everybody and throws them in a car and starts to roll. And she calls the sheriff's office. And she's the one who gets the alert put out from law enforcement by calling the sheriff's office. We know the defendant is hiding something. It's like a kid would do. When you don't want anybody to look over there, you say, hey, look over here. So the defendant's going to tell people, Dylan walked to the dam. We'll talk about that in a minute. Or to Bayfield. And his fishing pole is gone. He keeps pointing in the wrong direction. In fact, when he's up on Middle Mountain Road days later with Brandon Redwine, he tells Brandon after a short period of time, he's not up here. Brandon testified about his dad. That's when I realized he had done something. That's when I realized he knew something. How would he know that Dylan wasn't up there? We hadn't even looked. We turned around and went the other way. He keeps pointing in the other direction. And actions speak louder than words. Search and rescue describes the defendant as tired, unkempt, laid back, nonchalant. He's not frantic at all. He also doesn't help on November 19th when search and rescue is out there. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. He doesn't help look for his son. He turns off the lights, including the outdoor light, and the significance of that is that the night before, at 2 o'clock in the morning, that light is on. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the neighbor sees the light on outside. The next night, when his son is missing, he turns off the outside light because no one needs to find their way home. He knows where Dylan is because he knows exactly what he did to Dylan. So he's the one person in the world who's not surprised or shocked or out searching in a state of panic. The defendant sleeps the full night on November 19th because he's exhausted. He was up late the night before. So there's no calls, no text, and no search. We have Roy Vreeland from Search and Rescue, who volunteers 20 days of his time. As a volunteer, 20 days of his time over the next month. This guy doesn't give it 20 minutes. And he wants you to believe that he thought his son was missing. Everyone else in the world is in a state of panic that night. It is dark, it is November, and Dylan is gone. Everyone is up, everyone is anxious, everyone is searching except for the murderer. He is home asleep, lights off. Think about a member of the family missing, just gone. And a family member going to sleep and turning off all the lights, including the outside lights, while Search and Rescue is still outside looking for him, ladies and gentlemen. Search and Rescue is still out there. And then we have Elaine. She's driving from the Springs down to Durango. November 19th. It's 4:59. And she starts calling Dylan. These are all calls from Elaine Hall to Dylan. 4:59, 5:08, 5:30, 5:56, 6:12. It goes on and on. 8:37, 8:40, 8:40 again, 8:49, 9:23. He's asleep. 9:52, 9:52. After midnight. 11:31, after midnight, 1:55 in the morning, 2:35 in the morning. They're at the Bayfield Marshal's office that night, along with law enforcement, because everyone's in a state of panic because no one, except for this guy, knows where Dylan is. The things he does after tell us so much about what he did on the night of November 18th, 2012. Because the next morning, it goes on. A well-rested defendant comes outside. I want you to picture this in your mind. The defendant comes outside. Search and Rescue's across the street. They've already been looking. They're already out there. The defendant has a cup of coffee, and he sits in the chair and watches. He just sits there and watches. There's one reason that the defendant doesn't say, hey, any news on my son? Hey, did you find Dylan? Hey, where are you guys looking today? Any updates? He already knows the answer. He already knows the answer. There's no other logical reason that you sit down and have a cup of coffee when everyone in the world, including Search and Rescue volunteers across the street from your house, are looking for Dylan. He sits down and has a cup of coffee. Let that image stay with you as you go back to deliberate, because it's completely consistent with the defendant knowing what he did to Dylan and knowing where Dylan was, and inconsistent with anything else in the world. The defendant deliberately and repeatedly misdirects investigators. As the defendant makes statements to law enforcement and to the FBI and to other individuals, he's going to try to cover up the things that he can't admit. But if you look closely, you'll see even the truth in those details. It's no coincidence that Dylan's last text ever is sent around the same time they're roughhousing. And by the way, when you read the defendant's written statement, his full written statement, the defendant says, "We started roughhousing and tension started to subside." Does that sound normal to you? We started wrestling and then the tension got better? But the defendant says that's happening right around the time Dylan sends his last text ever. They're having physical contact. Dylan's phone goes dead right around the same time the defendant claims he went to bed. These are not coincidences, ladies and gentlemen. The defendant's trying to shroud the truth from you because he doesn't want to be held responsible. Dylan walked, according to the defendant. He tells Roy Breland he walked to the dam. That's 9 miles. He says he walked to Ryan's house, 21 miles away. At the start of this trial, in his opening statement to you, the defendant said Ryan Nava lived right down the road. True, but it was 21 miles down the road. And Dylan may have walked there. That's a 42-mile round-trip walk that the defendant, in his opening statement, said to you was a possibility. Dylan went fishing. We've heard a lot about that. The defendant tells Agent Grusing, "I looked for the fishing pole, this 6-foot fishing pole, for 1 hour. I looked in all the logical places. Anywhere where it would be kept, I looked, the fishing pole is gone." He tells everyone the fishing pole is missing. Go look down by the lake. The fishing pole is missing. Go look down by the dam. He may have gone fishing down there and walked 9 miles to the dam, even though we know from Dylan's friends and family he would never do that. That's not behavior he would engage in, walking that far to go fishing by himself. He tells Elaine in a text message, the fishing pole is gone. And as a result, we know that efforts are diverted away from the defendant's dump site for Dylan on Middle Mountain. And all the efforts are going to the lake. They bring in a dive team from New Mexico. And as you think about how many people worked on this case, how many people responded to the calls for help, how many people tried to assist in finding Dylan, think about that dive team for a minute. This team rolls up from New Mexico, and they go plunging into Vallecito Lake in November, because this guy says the fishing pole is gone. And in some ways, he's right. Because when the FBI, CBI, and the sheriff's office search his house, the fishing pole is gone. It's not there. It's not there because the defendant's trying to cover his tracks. And it's not until after Dylan's remains are found that he finally turns over the fishing pole to investigators. And then we have the defendant's lack of action, any action at all, completely consistent with being the murderer, who knows where Dylan's body is, and inconsistent with any other human being, let alone family member, in the weeks and months that followed Dylan's disappearance. He knows where Dylan is. So the defendant calls Dylan at 7:19 a.m. on November 20th. According to the defendant, Dylan has gone missing sometime around mid-morning on November 19th. He calls Dylan on November 20th. That's the last staged attempt he'll make to reach Dylan for the rest of the year. You are here, ladies and gentlemen, because you have common sense and you have life experience. And I would ask you to ask yourself what you would expect from a parent whose kid has gone missing the day before. And now he doesn't call or text Dylan that week, the next week, the following week, the week after that, or the week after that, or the next one after that. And he's also engaging in no attempts to help locate his son. 0 attempts to try to contact his son, and only participates in one search in a different area. Maybe he's lazy. I can't tell you what goes on in his mind. I can't tell you that. Maybe he thinks he's outsmarted everyone. Maybe he thinks the story is going to be enough. He certainly underestimates the continued efforts of Dylan's family and Dylan's friends, who keep looking, who hold a vigil, who are determined to find Dylan. He certainly fails to recognize that the sheriff's office and all the people who work there are going to do their very best to find Dylan. And they're going to call in all the assistants and all the experts they can to help locate Dylan and then investigate and prosecute his killer. Most of all, the defendant taking no action is completely consistent with him having disposed of Dylan's body. So the FBI arrived to assist in locating Dylan. Picture it. Dylan's been gone about a week, and the FBI rolls into town to help locate Dylan. If you're a family member and the FBI shows up at your house, or shows up at your house, and your kid's missing, you're in one of two camps. You're either in the, thank God the FBI is here, or you're in the, oh God, the FBI is here. The second camp is you are the murderer. The first camp is you are a parent who's hyper-concerned, who's doing everything he or she can to find your son, and is just glad that the reinforcements of the FBI are coming in, including Agent Grusing, who gets the written statement from the defendant on November 26th in his own words. You can read it. It says, tell me every detail, no matter how small. This is about the disappearance of his son. It talks about the roughhousing and the tension starting to subside. No mention of injuries or blood. Also, no details of how the night ended with Dylan. If someone is missing in an individual's life, and they ask you, when you saw them last night, how did it go? You end with the, I said goodnight, I gave him a hug, I gave him a kiss, I gave him a high five, he went to bed, I went to bed. Those details are missing because those details did not happen. And in the written statement, there's no mention of injuries or blood. And then Agent Grusing has a follow-up discussion on November 26th. The defendant talks about the relationship, talks about Dylan being upset, standoffish, being upset about the iTunes card, which we see him looking at in the Walmart video, and repeatedly blaming Elaine, which really strikes Agent Grusing as strange. And the defendant talking about the fact that they'd been on that trip to Chicago and he'd gone on Dylan's phone without Dylan's permission and had seen what Dylan was sending. Remember those text messages that Dylan sent to Corey saying, send me the poop pics over and over and over and over and over again? The defendant, in that interview on November 26th, says, I tackled Dylan onto the couch. 13-year-old boy who wants nothing to do with his father. Tackles him onto the couch. And Agent Grusing, because this is what the FBI does, and they're the best of the best, said, any blood, any injuries at all? No. Nothing at all. The defendant says he either went fishing or he ran away because of Elaine. November 27th, Agent Grusing is back. He has follow-up questions. The defendant answers. He's holding a pillow. He appears like he was either intoxicated or sad. And the defendant tells the whole story yet again, and it's basically the same, including no blood and no injuries. November 28th, after law enforcement briefs together, and they realize we have inconsistent statements, there's concerning actions and inactions by the defendant, and given the defendant's behavior and what they've learned from Elaine and Corey and others about the incredibly toxic relationship with the defendant, and the fact that Dylan did not want to go but only went because the judge made him. They go back on November 27th, and they ask on November 27th, can you come down on November 28th, we want to talk to you. And the defendant's a no-call, no-show. So the FBI works with the La Plata County Sheriff's Office, and they get a court-approved search warrant. And on November 29th, they go. And Agent Grusing intentionally sets up outside the FBI evidence recovery team truck and says to the defendant, the truck is from the evidence recovery team. They do an extremely thorough search. They're going to search the whole house. And for the first time in 10 days, to anybody, the defendant blurts out, you know what? Dylan was bleeding from a cold sore. It was just dripping blood onto the floor. They spent 5 hours together. The fact that that detail had never been shared tells you everything you need to know about the defendant's guilt. And what happens next confirms it. Because Agent Grusing says, well, you know what? I'll be able to confirm whether he was dripping blood from a cold sore by talking to the flight attendants or talking to his family or getting a picture like this one or the other ones you've seen. And the defendant realizes that that story is not going to work. So for the first time ever, he says he hurt his lip on a Nerf football. You've seen the Nerf football. You felt it as it went around. I watched you squeeze it. And you sat in that living room across the hallway because we wanted to show you there's no way a Nerf football can be thrown at that distance and crack open someone's mouth. There's also no way this story makes sense. And the defendant's telling it for the first time because the evidence recovery team has arrived. And they are, in fact, about to find blood in the defendant's living room. The defendant goes on to say, Dylan spit blood on the floor. They drive to the FBI office for a longer discussion, and he tells Agent Grusing about what was going on during that day. He also gives a really interesting fact for you to consider as we think about what happened to Dylan's belongings, which is, I took his black shirts and shoved them back into his backpack and zipped it shut and said, I'm not your mother. His son had just arrived for a 1-week stay. The house is not that clean. This is one of those things that the defendant shares because it's partially true. He did touch the black shirts. Dylan found dead in a black shirt, and he did touch the backpack, which is never seen again. But it's certainly not because he's just getting tidy. And even then he says, I'm not your mother. That story is not true. The defendant argues a whole lot of things here at trial, ladies and gentlemen, but I would ask you to keep in mind what he told Agent Grusing on November 29th, 2012. What he tells you through Agent Grusing is there's a less than a 5% chance Dylan's run away. He was not kidnapped. This is the defendant, given where he lives. Possibly an animal attack? Asked Agent Grusing. What about a bear? And to this, the father of the missing son, who's been missing for 10 days, lights up and becomes animated. And Agent Grusing tells you how concerned that made him. You're not supposed to be excited about a bear eating your kid. Why do you seem animated and excited right now? And the conversation turns, and Agent Grusing confronts him and says, you seem to be involved in it. Now's your turn. Now's your chance to tell me. And Agent Grusing says, you're on the side of a mountain, and the boulder's coming down. You can either get out of the way, or you can just let it roll down upon you. That's my way of saying justice is going to come. Think about a parent who is not the murderer, who hears this from the FBI. If you're the murderer, you react exactly like this guy did. He slumps his shoulders, he goes down, and he says, I have to start thinking of myself. And that's the end of the interview right there.
Mr. Doherty, you have slightly less than an hour.
Thank you, Ron. The defendant dropped Dylan's body over a trail, so he knows exactly where Dylan is, and this is why he's telling Agent Grusing these falsehoods. The defendant disposing of the body, he did that to try to cover his tracks. He did that to try to destroy the evidence. He did that to make sure, or to try to make sure, that justice would never come down. But it's coming, because the body is ultimately found. And the body reveals to you that it's a murder. And the fact that the defendant disposed of his son's body the way he did reveals that it's not an accident, what happened in the house on November 18, 2012. Certainly not an accident. And the body itself, as it was recovered when it was, reveals blunt force trauma to Dylan's skull, Dylan's head, and sharp force injuries to the right zygomatic arch of his skull. And by getting rid of the body, the defendant was able to tell people Dylan just simply disappeared. He went fishing, he went for a walk, something must have happened, maybe it was an animal. He's ready to rattle off any option. And it's because of what the defendant did to his son. It's because the defendant left Dylan's body out there that Dylan is eaten by scavengers. He's eaten by animals. And his remains are spread out all over the place. And his family is left with so little of Dylan. but enough that the experts that you can rely upon were able to determine this is a homicide. And the injury was not just one place, but two places. And everything the defendant does after is consistent with murder in the second degree. The defendant knowingly killed Dylan Redwine. He was guilty of child abuse resulting in death. And we talked in jury selection about what it means to act knowingly. We talked about the difference between a husband-wife altercation where one of them waits for the other to come home and has a handgun. Do you remember this? Handgun and shoots the person on purpose. That's intentionally. It's murder in the first degree. Murder in the second degree, when you act knowingly, is you're having the discussion in the kitchen, as we described in jury selection, and one party becomes upset and hits the other in the head during the argument with a frying pan, knowingly. That's what we have here. Let me ask you a question that I'm then going to answer, which is, what if the defendant succeeded and the remains were never found? What if Dylan's body was never found? He almost got away with it. He almost succeeded in making sure that the remains were never found. Another year, maybe 2, maybe 3, or if La Plata County Sheriff's Office didn't give this their all, along with volunteers from this community and search and rescue, perhaps Dylan's remains would never be found. And I'd be right here, because he'd still be guilty of murder. And it'd be what's called a no-body homicide, where we know there's one person in the world who had the access, the opportunity, and the reason, and that person killed the victim and succeeded in getting rid of the body, and that happens. But it didn't happen here, because Middle Mountain was searched extensively, exhaustively, by search and rescue and by volunteers, and by Dylan's family, and Dylan's friends, but not by this guy. Because he tells them he missed emails and he missed the phone calls about it because his cell phone was broken. And we know from investigative accounting that that story is actually, again, not true. The defendant goes away during the time of the Middle Mountain search. And the defense will tell you, oh, it was because he was working. But then ask yourself, well, why doesn't he call once between June 21st and June 25th to ask for an update on the search? And on June 27th, he's told his son's remains have been found. Your son's remains have been found. And later the same day, he's on the phone with Brandon, his son, who for a long time had no contact except a court order that forced Brandon to be with him on one occasion, who suspected him of being involved in Dylan's death. And he tells Brandon, without the skull, they're not going to be able to figure out if it's blunt force trauma or not. His son had just been found that day, and that's his reaction. He cries when he's with law enforcement for a few seconds. He's on the phone with Brandon later saying, without the skull, they can't prove blunt force trauma. And Brandon says, what's she talking about? And contacts law enforcement that same day. It's his son. Think about how well Brandon Redwine knows this guy. And he knows based on that, I need to contact law enforcement. And the remains are found only because of this type of effort you see on the screen, ladies and gentlemen. Climbing up the steep slope to the trail used by the defendant to dump Dylan's body. Hand over hand, climbing through there, doing this grid search. And as a result of that kind of effort, they find the first primary remain site, which is 8.6 miles from Mark's house. And then they find the cranium later when the Fosters are hiking, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But when you look at this map, and you look at the fact that Mark was at the end of this dead end, the remains are in the first place you would leave them if you're Mark Redwine, and the last place in the world anybody else would have a reason to be. They're close to his house. And it's called the primary remain site. And it's a classic dump site. And that's the words of Dr. France, who took the stand and testified before you. And she's an expert in this. And this is what she does in her work with NecroSearch. They go out and they look for bodies. But we actually, before I talk about Dr. France, we have two people who know the subject matter really well. We have two people who know the subject matter about where the defendant would leave Dylan's body after killing Dylan on November 18, 2012. One of them knows the subject very well. That's Betsy Horvath, the defendant's ex-wife, who calls law enforcement unprompted, just a few days after Dylan's disappearance, and says, based on what the defendant has told me in the past, I think he would take Dylan's body and dump it in the mountains and not make any effort to bury the body. This is in November of 2012. It's months before the remains are found. And a woman who knew the defendant better than most people, his ex-wife, is calling law enforcement to say, check the mountains, and I bet you didn't bury the body. And then we have Dr. France, who talks about, in a case such as this, the suspect will be familiar with the area. Check. Remains close to a road or a vehicle access point. Check. Footpath downhill from that road. Check. And consider the physical size of the suspect and the victim. In this case, we know Dylan was much smaller than the defendant. The defendant having the remains found close to his house tell you so much. And the fact that there are two different locations tell you even more. The defendant had placed the body in the perfect place in which he had the limited time to do it, when he had that light on at 2 o'clock in the morning. And it's also the last place in the world anyone else would do so. Now, from the very beginning of this trial, and actually from the very beginning of this investigation, the defendant has argued Dylan was not murdered. It is not a murder. Animal attack, something else, but not a murder.
When you present our argument, Judge.
Again, the jury will remember with their collective memory what's been argued or opening statements, and they will be able to listen to both sides in their closing arguments. Go ahead, Mr. Doherty.
Thank you, Your Honor. When you showed up for jury selection for this case, you might have thought, they're going to say someone else did. The defendant knows that if it's a murder, there's only one logical person, and it's him. He's the last person to have that contact, access, and reason to kill Dylan. So the defendant will tell you it's Mother Nature, because he knows once you determine it's a murder based on what Dr. Kurtzman said, and what Dr. France testified, and all the evidence in the case, that he's the person who's held responsible for it. That's why he tells you all the injuries are from some other cause, not from a murderer. Because once you see the evidence and hear the testimony that it's a murder, you know it's him. Who had reason to take Dylan's backpack, ID, debit card, iPod, and phone? Let's start with the backpack. If Dylan were actually going fishing, he would have left his backpack at home. If you're hanging out with his friends, backpack at home. He had no reason to take the backpack with him. The defendant's story is he was supposed to be coming back to pick up Dylan at 11 or 11:30. The defendant admits having contact with the backpack, pushing the shirts into the backpack, and that's no coincidence, ladies and gentlemen. The backpack disappears forever. So does the cell phone. There's no animal or stranger or Mother Nature who's going to take the backpack and cell phone of Dylan Redwine. The only person, the only creature in the entire world to do it is the defendant. Because he wants to make it difficult for law enforcement to identify Dylan, and also to make sure that it can't be traced back to him. So he takes Dylan's phone, he takes his iPod. In a lot of ways, when he took those things, he cut Dylan's life and lifeline. And in fact, speaking of cuts, I'd ask you to remember the defendant's expert who said Dylan's headphones, Exhibit 320, appeared to be cut. Or perhaps by a claw. And you can look yourself at 320. And this was the defendant's expert. Dylan's debit card. Let's talk about this briefly. We know Dylan has a debit card. The only debit card, and it has its name on it. And there's a balance of $2,000.06 in the account. And we see the text messages between Dylan and the defendant saying, can you send me the PIN number, please? Because the PIN number was sent separately to the defendant's house. And Dylan texts him on those dates you see on the screen, the 3rd and the 4th and the 16th of September, and Dylan's trying to access the bank account. Dylan has the bank card on him. He has the debit card. It's in his possession. On November 18th, he arrives. He spends a very limited amount of time with the defendant. And when the defendant tells the stories about what happens between he and Dylan, he never once mentions the debit card. And yet, when a warrant is issued later, it's found that the defendant's in possession of Dylan's bank card. This is the same guy who told search and rescue, I don't have a single possession. I don't have anything at all. And in fact, while his son was still missing, the defendant transfers $2,000 out of Dylan's personal account. His son is missing, and he's taking his son's money out of his account. His son won't be able to access it then or ever. But the defendant does it because he knows Dylan will never have a need or the ability to access it again because Dylan's dead. But when you go back to deliberate, ask yourself, how did the defendant end up with Dylan's debit card? And the answer, ladies and gentlemen, is he took all the possessions and got rid of everything that could tie Dylan to him, tie the body to him, except the debit card, because the debit card could potentially have value for him. He was able to transfer that money by going to the bank. But he took all the money out of his son's account, $2,000. He left 6 cents in his son's account when he thought his son was missing. Then we have the partial cranial. You heard the testimony from Dr. Kurtzman and Dr. France about the shortcuts to the right zygomatic arch and the blunt force trauma to the front of the head. And it's the very reason the defendant wanted to hide this part of Dylan's body. He didn't want anybody to find it. He didn't want it to be seen. But it was found in enough time for the experts to figure out what happened. And you can look at the cranium as a model that Dr. France brought, and you see the radiating fracture from a blow. And you heard Dr. Kurtzman talk about how there's a fracture to one's face that could cause a radiating fracture up into the head if someone is slammed into something forcefully, like a coffee table, or something is slammed against their head forcefully. And it's called homicide. We have it here on the day it was found by the Fosters and law enforcement in 2015. And you see the result of the blunt force trauma, the fracture of the skull. And then the cuts. The defense expert, Eric Smith, told you these cuts seem to him, in his expert opinion, to be the result of slicing, cutting action. You see it there as well. This defendant is guilty, ladies and gentlemen. He is guilty of murder in the second degree and child abuse resulting in death. He was the last person seen with Dylan. When Dylan goes completely dark and is never heard from again, he's in a living room with this guy. He's angry and upset and rageful. Dylan's blood is in his living room. He has the smell of a dead body in the same room, on his clothes, and in his truck. And he has Dylan's debit card. Changing stories and behavior are incredibly suspicious and evasive until you realize it's completely consistent with a murderer. He lives in that isolated area right where the remains are found. And blunt force trauma and sharp force injuries are found on Dylan Redwine's head. During the trial, we talk about cuts to the right zygomatic arch. What we're talking about is the murder of a 13-year-old boy. And the defendant was guilty of it, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a break. It'll be lunch is here. I got word that lunch was here, so you will have to remain together. Cindy will make sure that you stay together. Remember, my admonitions, you've heard some of the closing arguments. You haven't heard all of them. There's another instruction in verdict forms that we need to go over. So it's too early for you guys to start talking about this case and making any decisions on the case. You do not discuss this case amongst yourselves or anyone else. Don't talk with any witnesses or the defendant. Don't gather any information on your own. We will start up again at 12:20. And with that, we'll be in recess. Everybody rise for the jury. All right, we'll be in recess.
Thank you, Your Honor.